Hello and welcome to History Bubble. Today we'll be looking at one of history's most inexplicable events or trends, that being the rise of the West. This event is particularly odd, considering that for most European history, they were relatively backward compared with the rest of the world regions, which were at the same place developmentally for the most part. That was until the Great Divergence, as the rise of the West is often called.
The regions compared differ with different historians, but the usual ones are China, India, the Middle East and Europe, although the last is often only added at a later date, until then being a part of the Middle East, similar to North Africa. The date for Europe's inclusion as a major region often comes as the rise of Rome, Christianity, or even later, some even suggesting that it should not be added to the same rank as the others, well into the second millennium. Southeast Asia and Central Asia are also sometimes added at certain points in time where they were strong, but these are for the most part excluded or added as subregions of the three major parts. Sub-Saharan Africa, Oceania and Americas are almost always excluded, or at least until parts of the Americas and Oceania became part of the region what is now often called the West, which sprung out of Europe.
The first big problem posed when trying to answer this question is what counts as the West and what is Western. There are many definitions of this, such as culture, religion, economy or democracy, but most of these are quite arbitrary and very hard to define. This makes them quite unuseful for describing how a country came to rise, since it's either describing success as a country as becoming Western, or is quite ignorant of how other countries work.
The shifting dominance of different culture, for the lack of a better word, and the globalization which has led to the diffusion of culture between different regions. The definition of religion and culture might work with some theories of the Great Divergence, where these things play a large part in shaping the West, but most modern theories do not follow this conclusion, rendering these definitions unusable for most explanation. The many different explanations for what counts as Western often originate from when the rise is proposed to take place. This leaves us with another question before the first one has even been answered, and this one is much harder to know. When did the West become much more advanced than the other world regions? The answer you receive for these questions heavily depends on who you ask, but the most common answer is around 1500, which was about the same time the Americas were discovered, and the Cape of Good Hope was traversed by the Europeans. This date is most advocated by those who felt that culture, societal structure or geography were the most important to the rise of the West. This claim is substantiated by the fact that a lot of the world fell to the Europeans at that time. They even managed to get cities on the coast of some of the most developed Asian regions, although most of these were tiny and some could scarcely even be called more than a district of a city, with a lot of Europeans in it. The victory of the Europeans in many naval engagements against larger Asian navies also contributed to this hypothesis. In recent times, a new theory has struck up, which is often called the California School, which suggests that the rise of Europe in development above Asia occurred with the Industrial Revolution. The main evidence for this is that before the revolution, basically the only thing Europe contributed to Asia's economy was gold, and they bought many processed goods from these countries, which shows Europe's industrial weakness. Some also take the middle ground between these two theories and say that Europe were mostly behind Asia in 1500, but advantages were had in some areas such as naval technology, and development was more rapid, so quick advancement would lead them to be as developed as Asia before the Industrial Revolution. Other suggestions include that Europe always had faster development, but did not reach a level higher than Asia before 1500 because of the late start. There are of course many sub-theories with some centuries difference from the 1500 date, with differing reasoning attached. Of course these theories have much more evidence to suggest them and counter-evidence to disprove the others, which will be discussed in the following episodes of this series. Meanwhile, a somewhat acceptable answer can now be given to the question of what constitutes as the West. If the industrial hypothesis of the California School should be pursued, it might be argued that early industrializers should be considered the West, and the term is now unuseful as so many nations have industrialized that are so different, rendering the word redundant. It could also be argued that the nations which profited from industrialization in its early stages should still be called Western, since they had a huge head start from other nations, which means they became so rich they still dominate large part of the world and hold large influence internationally. Seeing that all major world power with the exception of China were fairly early industrializers, and according to this definition would qualify as Western. If instead 1500 was the time of the Great Divergence, the definition of Western must change depending on the primary reason of the thesis. If culture was the definition, Western culture must be found in the countries which are supposed to be called the West. Otherwise, if religion was the primary reason, it would be suggested that Protestant, Catholic and maybe Orthodox countries would be considered Western, but Christian Africa and South America are often left out, even if this definition is used. The early colonizing countries and ones with major scientific technological breakthroughs within Europe and the colonies could also be considered Western, if colonization or science is seen as the most important part of the rise respectively.
Else, an accumulation of all these different things might be considered to constitute what is so-called Western. In the end, none of these ideas of what should be Western are specifically useful, as there are always border cases and exceptions, and there is a question if the West should even be a term. But even when this is the case, history shows a clear advancement within the European and European-inspired world, which cannot be discounted, and there is a need to name these countries which is the West. So even while the answers of what should be considered Western are not satisfactory, we still need them to describe the historical regions which participated in the Great Divergence, even if the same definitions cannot be used today. There are many problems with this, such as different regions having differing amount of records and preserved historical artifacts. Besides, different regions have had differing amount of study by historians, so some regions we know a lot more about than others. These things are of course accounted for in most calculations, but it's still very hard for them to know how much difference should be accounted for. The California School often criticized these studies for being too Eurocentric and say that Europe has a lot more records, especially available to Western historians, compared to the rest of the world, which is served to make Europe feel way more advanced than they really were compared to other regions.
The Eurocentric worldview would also see that the rise of the West happened in the 16th century, and then it would seem normal that Europe would be more wealthy than the rest of the world after that date. Therefore, these anti-Eurocentrists argue that there are better ways to measure economic development, such as measuring lifespan and nourishment, that can be measured from corpses, which make the data way more reliable.
Although the problems already addressed are major, there is nothing compared to that of facing the hindsight fallacy, which for those of you who don't know is put simply when you said something was inevitable, when at the time no one could know what would happen. If something is argued in that way, it is not necessarily wrong, but it's quite easy to be. When this is related to the rise of the West, it is easy to see how Europe's advantages must be essential for the Great Divergence, while Asia's disadvantages would surely not the correct ones to be able to lead to the scientific the industrial revolution. The problem with arguing this way is that history is very messy and almost impossible to predict. If we look at modern experts' predictions of the future, it's easy to see how varied and different they are, and how what at the time looks like important events turns out to be some of the most important parts of the historical narrative.
This fallacy is especially harsh to proponents of geography or culture being the main factors of the divergence, although slightly less so for culture. The reason for this is that these specifically built so to say that the course of history was decided from a very early stage in a way that is measurable. For example, proponents for it being geography that led to the rise of Europe often argue that the many peninsulas of Europe led to great navies, which led to commerce, which led to wealth and more technologies. The problem with this is that it's nothing inherent which would make Europe's many peninsulas in need of great naval technology, even though they would of course be prone to have more ships. For example, if it was instead India who rose with their great navies, it could easily be argued that their geography made them have great navies, since unlike in most other places, they had larger need for ships capable of non-coastal sailing. Especially in South India, the merchants would save a lot of time by sailing the open sea. Otherwise, if Indonesia would have had the world's best navies, you could use a lot of good arguments were so great for the advantages of naval technology. Cultural arguments also often fall into this category, such as the argument that Europeans tended to marry late and thus have fewer children. This argument overlooks the other way. Culture might limit birth control, which is easy to do, since there are no good statistics of birth rates before 1800 would make it an hypothetical argument.
There's an easy way of deflecting these arguments, which is to agree that these only explain what happened and not why it happened, or to say that the rise of the West was likely. The difference might seem small, but it changes everything.
There is a difference between saying that Europe's geography was the reason for Europe being able to rise and saying that Europe's geography gave it a unique possibility for the region to rise.
The second one is much worse, since it disregards the unique advantages which might have been just as likely to lead to the rise if history had just been slightly different. The hindsight fallacy is also a large part of Eurocentrism, which in this context of the divergence has to do with most arguments stating that Europe was certain to be the first to rise, and that they had the specific advantages which needed to be in place for the divergence to happen.
Opposing Eurocentrism has been the major goal of the Californians' goal. They see most historical texts as continuing this trend of viewing Europe as superior to the rest of the world. More often than not, this is not intended, and because Europe revolutionized, the advantages are put forth. The disadvantages explained away, with the opposite occurring to the rest of the world. The overviewing criticism towards the Californians' goal is quite similar, but that they instead focus too much on Asia's advantages instead of disadvantages, and overlook the different major victories won by the Europeans over advanced civilizations in Asia. Europe had also had a huge advantage in scientific development, as well as institutions, which they argue is overlooked by these scholars.
Arguments go far more in depth and far more exist. This was only a shallow introduction to the topic, and in the next video